Thank you. Of course, I also want to start with thanking everyone here who made this possible, and especially also for inviting me. I think at this point of the conference we can say that it has been amazingly rich and inspiring, and I really want to thank you for making this possible. And of course, I also want to say thanks. I'm deeply grateful for being part of the Mosse Program, standing here maybe as a granddaughter or even great-granddaughter in academic terms. And I want to share some of my research with you, which has been inspired by this program and by my time, both in Madison but also in Jerusalem. This past April, the Forum on Contemporary Photography series at MoMA hosted a meeting on photographic representations and colonial discourses. Scholars and artists discussed the following provocative thesis voiced by photography curator Roxana Marcacci, who claimed, since its inception in 1839 and to the present, photography has been deeply shaped by inherently colonialist ideologies, and the practice of photographic seeing has never been freed of its voyeuristic and authoritative character. The participants considered that attempts to write alternative photographic histories or to engage in the respective artistic projects still come with persistent challenges. For example, the photographic archive of what has come to be believed Western civilization's collective visual memory mirrors the limited effort to preserve collections of early indigenous photography. These collections carry the reproach of being made in Saadian style to categorize the other according to Western measurements and criteria, to eventually better understand the self. This criticism was initially voiced for 19th century photographic practices. However, theorists such as Roland Barthes and Alan Sekula aimed the same reproaches at 20th century social documentary realism, a style that initially wore the aura of utmost humanist intention. Professional documentary photographers directing their cameras downward and selling their views were claimed to follow the same patterns as earlier colonial photographers, even if these patterns now came in the disguise of compassion and concern. Considering the fame such photographs often garnered their makers, it seems difficult to repudiate this claim. Yet I suggest that the same approach that sheds the idea of the concerned eye, namely one that sets the creation of such images within a broader historical context, claiming to trace their identity as mere commodity, can also grant insight into alternative readings of these photographs. Such readings allow also for a focus on the conditions of the production of documentary photography rather than merely their function and their use. Many of these stories begin with the encounter of photojournalism and social documentary photography in Weimar, Germany. Tracing the careers of German Jewish photojournalists before and beyond 1933 offers entry points for alternative histories of photographic encounters. While some such encounters have been discussed in recent research, those who took place beyond the usual Western centers of photography are rarely mentioned. The transplantation of the collaboration of photojournalism with social documentary realism into colonial contexts, however, did take place, and it deserves our attention because it complicates the claim of the colonialist gaze. First, I will explain what I mean by the Weimar German collaboration of photojournalism and social documentary realism, and then we will move to 1940 India to explore what happened when this kind of photography was inserted into colonial contexts. At the heart of this exploration is the work of German Jewish photojournalist Tim Gidal, a contemporary and friend of George Mosse. This paper thus contributes to discussions on the export and transfer of Weimar culture by means of Jewish expulsion and dispersion, as well as on non-European forms of nationalism. By means of tracing the path of the stateless traveler Gidal, I will look, moreover, at nationalism's abnormalities, liminalities, and alternatives. Weimar German photographic culture was dominated by two new developments regarding photography's standing and function. First, there was a new consciousness about the possibilities, meanings, and challenges of trading photographs as messages. Such messages included the difficult political and social conditions of the early Weimar years, suggesting social reform. On the other hand, there was a persistent skepticism of whether photography could be any more than a commodity and whether it could be granted the label of art. Initially, photography had a mixed reputation among the avant-garde. It was a product of the age of mechanical reproduction and as such unable to represent genuine beauty. Instead, it placed itself in the direct service of mass consumption co-opted by capitalism. It was not until 1929 that photography could be studied at the Bauhaus, even though Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who taught the Bauhaus Foundations course, had begun to consider the benefits of photography much earlier. In his writings, he claimed to be able to show that photography could be a productive art, able to be recruited for the purpose of directing the spectator's senses to what had hitherto been ignored. For this, however, photography had to submit to formalism. And indeed, social documentary photography adopted various of the ideas that Nagy preached, aiming with their photography at the deconstruction of established social and political norms and institutions. It was the illustrated newspaper blamed by Siegfried Krakauer for its nonsensical reproduction of the world that would offer a platform for the eventual collaboration between photographic formalism and documentary realism. Fueled by the new need for photographs, Berlin saw a growth in photo trade. And many of the most prolific photo agencies were actually settling and opening just here around Kochstraße. And they were important beginnings, important institutions for very important photographers' careers, such as Kurt Hatten, Kurt Hübschmann, or Felix Mann, or Robert Capa. And they also employed the brothers Georg Gidal and Tim Gidal. Born in Munich in 1909 to parents of Russian and Lithuanian descent, Tim Gidal came to photography when his brother Georg gave him a camera and sent him on his first assignment. Gidal's first photographs convinced his commissioners to welcome him into the photo business. Of special impact and inspiration to Gidal was photographer Otto Umber, who, working under the pseudonym of Umber, was one of the first to directly bridge the worlds of the Bauhaus with photojournalism. He taught at the former and worked for the latter. A second photojournalist who influenced Gidal was Walter Bossart. Bossart's effects on Gidal's career will be central to our discussion today, since Bossart, in his photo reports on Gandhi's March to the Salt, inserted travel into the photographic canon of the illustrated press. Travel photography bore little meaning for Berlin's photographers or their agents and editors who decried the genre for being romanticist. Travel photography usually subscribed to the sentimental conventions of photographic pictorialism, thereby corroborating colonial revisionist aspirations. Only slowly and by means of single works was the social documentary gaze of German Arbeiterfotografie extended to colonial context. Together with Bossart, the photographer Lotte R.L. was also influential. She undertook several trips through Africa in the early 1930s. In her works, R.L. expanded the photographic vocabulary of travel photography by means of low angles, close-ups, or other rather unconventional photographic approaches, creating a more egalitarian photographic encounter. The first attempts of an extension of photographic studies beyond the immediate Arbeitermilieu, such as these here, instilled within the Photographers Guild of the late 1920s the understanding that photo reports of exotic places could educate their viewers. In 1930, Gidal traveled on assignment for the first time after acquiring tower funds for a report on post-1929 Palestine. His aspiration was to better understand and explain Palestine to the German readership. Its photographs, printed in the Munich Illustrated Press and other newspapers upon his return, tell a story of Zionist successes. But Gidal also sought to portray the complexities of the country. Close examinations of two of these photographs prepare us for studying Gidal's later works done in India. Various of Gidal's images of Palestine show him stopping before those people who would hardly make it into the portfolios of a new Zionist iconography or a traveler's visual account of the Holy Land. The first example is this photograph of an elderly man repairing a plow. The man kneels on the ground and concentrates on his work. The camera is directed at him from a low angle. His back is round from years of hard work. The work he is currently engaged in does not look less straining. The heavy, bulky plow represents the rough conditions of farming in Palestine. Radiating from this image is the respect of the photographer both for the man's devotion and the expertise and experience unique to a man of his age. But the Zionist iconography of these days strove to project youth, productivity, and economic and political virility, and so depictions such as this one were neglected by most photographers. Similar in nature and function is a photograph of an Arab woman squatting on the ground of what seems to be a city street. She does not wear shoes, but a colorful striped garment and brass bracelets around her wrists. Her posture and gestures suggest aloofness. Gidal lowers the camera onto her level and shows her in a straight portrait rather than from a high angle. He creates an encounter that emanates interest in her story. At the same time, he does not expect any interaction, thereby granting the woman some of the agency over the way she is portrayed. While Gidal remains the ultimate bearer of power in the encounter, the honesty with which he captures this moment of poverty marks a break with the romanticization of natives in the past. It gives a glimpse into his Zionist convictions, which, as he himself later claimed in his memoirs, were Buberian in nature, coined by the same thoughts that also inspired the German Jewish masterminds of binationalism in Palestine. In 1936, after 2 years of studying in Switzerland, Gidal immigrated to Palestine, where he worked as a photographer for Reuters and the Zionist institutions. All in all, however, Palestine offered minimal professional opportunities, leading him to embark on a series of travels. In 1938, Gidal left for London. Some months later, he departed for Central and East Asia on a British troopship. In Bombay, he met Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru and was invited to join them at the All India Congress. Gidal traveled with a British troopship, but his identity as a photojournalist and as a German Jew apparently enabled him to transgress various national and ideological barriers. Gandhi's relationship with photography seemed to have been a friendly one. Photography had served him well. Since Walter Bossart's reports in 1930, photographers had become welcome visitors to Gandhi's India. Margaret Burke-White's 1946 photographs of Gandhi and a spinning wheel, taken in preparation for an article on India's leaders in Life magazine, remains iconic more than seven decades later. But also Gandhi's close followers engaged in portraying their leader. 2 years ago, a photo exhibition was launched showcasing for the first time the rediscovered works of Kanu Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi's nephew, who extensively portrayed his uncle throughout the final and most decisive decade of his life. Kanu Gandhi's photographs, and this is one of the photographs, Kanu Gandhi's photographs of his uncle circulated during much of his tenure, but his works fell into oblivion until recently. This affinity to photographers and the knowledge that it could serve Gandhi's cause was what might have allowed Gidal to join the All India Congress, even if he came to India on a British troopship. The following photograph is one of the most famous remnants of Gidal's India trip. It was used by various editors and printed in different articles in the United States and Britain. The photo is a close-up, taken from a distinctly low angle which boosts the leader's authority. Gidal seemingly attended the speech from the elevated point of the stage on which we also see Gandhi's closest followers. Male and female Congress participants are seated on the lower level, listening to Gandhi's words. His elevated index finger points up in the air in front of him. Followed by his gaze, his concentration radiates determination. The whole is decorated with flags of the Indian National Congress. The flag's blurriness contrasts starkly with the crisp appearance of Gandhi, simply clothed but concise in his goals and speech. Gidal somewhat translates the meaning of the moment into visuals. The same microphone was claimed moments later, it seems, by Gandhi's closest partner and later the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru. Gidal has come even closer and has chosen an extremely low angle. This angle and the garlands cutting the scene diagonally in the background, Neru's lifted arms, closed eyes, and open mouth, rendered the photograph extremely dynamic and almost dramatic in nature. The round microphone with the letters Chicago Radio alludes to a direct medial connection between India and the rest of the world. In his free time, Gidal traveled Bombay and the Indian hinterland. Two of his photographs are representative of a gaze combining his identities as both a traveler and a photojournalist. The following is a photograph taken of a street in Bombay. It shows a couple in a rickshaw drawn by a young boy with a turban. Next to the rickshaw, a car drives by. Another man, apparently ordered to manage Bombay's traffic, stands on a round pedestal. His arm points in the direction of traffic, but his actual role or meaning remains somewhat unclear since the street does not appear to be very busy. An advertisement decorates the street scene from the background, white scented letters reading Brook Bond Tea fill in the whole of the dark space. Brook Bond, founded in 1896 in London, was closely connected with Britain's colonial history in India, dominating not only the British but also the Indian tea market before entering also the American market under the label Red Rose Tea. Gidal's photographic insight into Bombay life through a street scene can essentially be understood as a photojournalist's mockery of British colonial rule. The Indian policeman has assumed authority over a territory that does not seem to need him. The oversized letters of a British brand are among the last remnants of British imperial reality. The rickshaw, on the other hand, used here apparently by locals as a painful sign not only of colonial rule, but also for inner Indian conflicts. The last photograph is a portrait of two men and a little boy in a semi-private setting. All men, including Gidal, sit on the floor. The two men looking at Gidal seem cheerful and comfortable with the camera. Their nakedness or poor appearance is not perceived as weakness. The focus is on their faces. Together with the social documentary gaze he developed during his Weimar years, Gidal seemed to aspire for a distinct sensitivity, rendering the camera a tool for translation, not distinction. The most important characteristics for this kind of photography were, in Gidal's own words, intuition and a strong sense of human contact. I want to conclude with some questions and remarks. Can we claim this photography to form part of the same social documentary realism coined during the Weimar period? If so, does the German Jewish experience have a special place in this seeing? And does it affect the reproach of the colonial gaze in any way? Gidal was a traveler to a foreign land who arrived on board of an army ship. He was a Western traveler to the East. He used the photographic grammar of first encounters, of curiosity, and of the desire to bring views back home. The circumstances of his travels, however, were the result of expulsion and statelessness. He was deprived of an immediate place to bring his photographs back to, and the lack of a mission and the curiosity as a photographer rid much of the gaze, of the determination and logics of travel photography. At the same time, he's a freelancer, interested in eventually selling his views. The authority exerted by the colonialist camera is not altogether absent. The subjects have no control over the use of their portraits. But while the index of the photography might derive from the same photographic semiotics of power of the apparatus, the encounter is the product of a large number of unplanned processes of displacement. The ends of these encounters are open. The photographed subject is allowed to reclaim some of the dignity the act of the photograph risks to deprive him or her of. It is this awareness that endows at least some of the products of social documentary photography with credibility, even or especially those taken in colonial contexts. What happens here, I suggest, is a double provincialization of the photographic and colonialist master narrative. One is forced by the exclusion of the liberal photographic grammar that had been shaped by a distinct group of mainly German Jews and that shaped their seeing in return. The other is voluntary, by directing the photographic lens towards the Indian anti-colonial struggle. This provincialization is absolute, ridding the gaze of one distinct opinion and ridding it also of a specific result. Gidal comes to India as an outsider in various ways, without much knowledge about these people and their struggles. without having anywhere else to go. His being an outsider in the conscious message that all he sees is worth seeing is also what makes his photographs attain a disinterested quality, something that renders them similar to his early works on Palestine. And it is this identity of an outsider that prevents him from falling for one distinct cause or a theme beyond observing them with his camera. Maybe it is exactly this experience that renders his photography a manifesto, one that is opposed to any kind of partisanship. As such, it is in sync with some of the left-wing theory that shaped the social discourses Gidal moved in, and which were coined, as George Mosse has pointed out, by a belief in Hegelian processes of ongoing struggles rather than in one specific outcome. Gidal's photography eventually is a journalistic portfolio, but it is also part of a humanist rhetoric spurred by the stateless journey of a German Jewish photographer. Thank you.